Hello, everybody, and thank you for your patience. So we are slowly getting to our second keynote, and it's my pleasure and absolute privilege to introduce to you in a little while Thanos Giannakopoulos from the UN Libraries. So the theme of LIBER this year is engage, collaborate, and innovate, with a very important addition saying libraries to address global challenges. And I think that in an uncertain world, it's good to know that you're not alone, but it's also very good to know that there are other organizations, global players, strong players out there with unique perspectives that we can actually learn from. So Janice, who is at the UN Libraries, and is Chief of the Information Management Section and Principal Librarian of the Dag Hammarskjöld Library at the UN Nations. Janice, or Thanos, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Okay, everybody can hear me. So, thank you very much, Thomas. I want to first of all, set the timer, which is always important. I want to thank the Conference Organizing Committee, the CPC, for the invitation. I want to thank LIBER. It's been 14 years since I was last time in LIBER, and I'm delighted to come back. It feels like coming back home, because I've been working as a research and data librarian at the International Atomic Energy Agency then, and now, of course, I have moved on. Just as a quick introduction, I manage the largest library in the United Nations Secretariat. This is the headquarters and, as we like to call it, flagship library of the United Nations. We are stationed in New York City. At the same time, the United Nations Secretariat has libraries around the globe, libraries or information management sections. You know, these two words, information management. I hope they mean something to you, because they still don't mean too many things to me. But then again, yeah, that's the titles. So we have a steering committee of the UN Secretariat Libraries. I co-chair the steering committee with my dear colleague from the UNOG Library in Geneva. And at the same time, I just want to mention that I'm wearing a second hat. The second hat is the fact that we in New York are the main conveners of the United Nations Open Science Conference. This is the largest open science conference on the map. Our 2023 instance of the conference had over 6,500 people attending. We had 2 outcomes, 35 countries, about 40 speakers, panelists, and keynotes. It was quite an event, and we were truly happy to bring this dialogue and debate into the United Nations headquarters. So we are indeed living in times of change and disruption. I think what I would like to emphasize today or highlight today is the fact that I wish to bring a little bit of a global perspective on the work of libraries. I think as research libraries, you are uniquely positioned to work on several fronts. And I would like to approach this by sort of like navigating, I'll try to do that quickly, through the policies of the United Nations, through the global policies of the United Nations that our governments have ratified. So 193 governments have ratified all these policies that I'm going to go through, with the exception of one. So these policies are more or less defining the Lebensraum, our space where we breathe, work, and produce impact. For the purpose of this presentation, I present these policies linearly, like policy 1, policy 2, policy 3. That's not how policies work. So these policies are very much intertwined, interconnected, and a failure in one policy immediately is a statement that the other policies are not going to be implemented. First of all, the Pact for the Future. From the Agenda 2030, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, up to the UN 75 Declaration, our common agenda, which is the vision of the Secretary General for the organization and the planet, to 11 policy briefs that have been released by the United Nations headquarters. there has been a lot of concentrated and carefully orchestrated work that led to the Pact for the Future. The Pact for the Future is the first international agreement of its kind for several years. It bears the commitment and it bears, of course, the agreement of 193 member states. It has 5 areas of, actually 56 commitments and 5 pillars of work. I will just elaborate a little bit one area, and again, all these areas are interconnected. Like youth and future generations are very much interconnected with the work of LIBER. But I just want to stay a little bit on the science, technology, and digital cooperation, which are actions 28 and 33. These are the core actions of our upcoming Open Science Conference. I'm not going to read this wonderful statement, but I think it speaks for itself. I see a lot of library work, research library work, libraries in general work into this statement, which is an official statement for the Declaration on Future Generations. So the actions 28 to 33 are actually actions that are presenting a policy framework that is supposed to align the research priorities that are sort of like envisioned for the way forward for the people and the planet. They go from decolonizing innovation up to ethical AI and so on. What I'd like to emphasize here is, first of all, that 4 billion people lack access to life-changing technologies around the globe. There's an extreme amount of growing inequalities regarding gender, regarding the power balances between North and South, regarding urban, rural. And there are some dual imperatives in these actions. First of all, we need to harness the benefits through open science and technology transfer and capacity building, but at the same time, we need to work on mitigating the risks to prevent discrimination, protect human rights, close gender gap divides, and so on. First of all, we at the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library immediately revisited our strategic outlook after the pact was ratified and agreed. So we needed as a library not only talk the talk, but we need to walk the walk, because we serve also offices within the UN Secretariat as well as the global public. So one of the items that we had, which was already in place since 2018, was to envision our library as one of the engines in the ecosystem of open science. Our library is a little bit of a peculiar library. We're a combination of we're actually a library that has parliamentary library functions, corporate library functions, and research library functions, as we serve the research of the UN and we perform research for the UN and about the UN. The one point that I wanted to highlight here is that we identified that there is a need to promote the right to read and publish, and I will expand a little bit more on this, and the need to see and implement science as a public good. And this is not only in this particular policy of the Pact for the Future, but you will see it replicating throughout this presentation of policies. We identified the need to host interdisciplinary forums, and that's why we enhanced our open science to include open scholarship and so on. I'll talk more about this down the line. We identified the open educational resource practices that need to be promoted. We also identified the need for the global network of institutional repositories and the need to introduce inclusive indexing, so include smaller publishers within the resources of the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library, the smaller publishers' output within the resources of the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library. We highlighted and continue to highlight the need for open licenses, and as well as we would advise against maximalistic approaches to copyright, especially given the guidance that the World Intellectual Property Organization has put forward, and of course the practice that the WIPO, as we call it, has implemented on their publications and data and so on. We need to mobilize universities, civil society, and other stakeholders through targeted partnerships. In a nutshell, we are trying to put forward the idea of libraries as science, technology, and innovation implementation partners. And as such, this is how we operate across the globe. In that respect, we more or less switched our conference to include the open scholarship elements. And this is probably more an issue of language because, as we all know, UNESCO Open Science Recommendation includes all fields. However, for those of you that speak German here, Wissenschaft in German includes all sciences. But when we started this debate and conversations from New York, we realized that open science people tended to think like natural sciences, or I don't know, physics, chemistry, this type of things, which is not, of course, the case. Open science is all sciences. So for that respect, we are upgraded a little bit the wording mostly, but not the actual action for that. So I would like to invite you to the 4th UN Open Science and Open Scholarship Conference, which is going to take place in Tokyo, 16 to 18 of October. There are links throughout this presentation, which I will share with LIBER. What we're going to discuss in that is more or less some of the topics that I hear in this conference, as well as the issue of equity. And I think equity in open science is something that we should not shy away from. Right? I hear many times that there are geopolitics happening. Yes, I know, the geopolitical crisis. I mean, I work in an organization that is being attacked almost daily now. So yes, there is a crisis happening around the globe, but as I mentioned, our governments have signed these policies, have agreed on these policies, and it is not always, we cannot expect governments to implement policies, right? We expect also the sub-national level, the national governments, the local governments, civil society, initiatives, and of course, libraries. Moving on to action 29. So with this bold letters is the action. I'm not going to repeat it, but more or less the idea here is to enhance capacity of STI in the global south. And I think that is the point that we again can play a role. I think it is really important that there is a strategic priority that connects what happens in Europe with the global south. And I come today here from China, where I was a week ago. And it is really interesting because when I was speaking in China, I had to sort of like rewire my brain because certain aspects are not like an issue of funding, for example, of funding for an activity or an initiative is not really an issue there because they're all state funded. In our case, we have to go into research councils, we have to go into foundations, including us in the UN. Increasingly, we have to more or less find external funding to implement our work. So in this regard, and again, within the context of the Pact for the Future, you may have heard of the United Nations Depository Library Program. So that was a program that was managed from the United Nations. It was created in order to share print publications from around the globe. So when a policy was printed, then the UN headquarters library would send this policy to libraries, depository libraries around the world. Of course, over time, like since 1992, the United Nations have moved into the digital field, and the print publication has been increasingly more or less like a dream nowadays because of the amount of funding that is required in order to secure the publications for us. So since we managed to release a very successful project which was culminated in the United Nations Digital Library, which is actually the repository of the United Nations in New York, everything, okay, let me rephrase this. The majority of the content can be traced to the UN Digital Library. So slowly, organically, we have moved outside of the UN Depository Library program. So what are we to do with this program? It's a historic program, supported the member states. So we started a full consultation that lasted about a year and a half. And we moved forward with the creation of a new knowledge network that is going to be connected with associations, with libraries, of course, around the world, and all sorts of libraries, right? Because the Depository Library Program was mostly national libraries and some university libraries. But we want now to expand this. We want to include public libraries. We want to work all together through the UN Charter Libraries Knowledge Network, where we will see how these policies that we talk about a lot, how are these being implemented? I mean, what are the initiatives that are connected to these policies? And how we can bring those perspectives, those interpretations of the policies into New York, into Geneva, and so on. Because in a nutshell, these policies are high-level ambitions. We need to offer some practicality to them. I'm not going to expand more on this. There is a link there. Please sign up for updates. We have a global town hall that is coming up towards the end of the year. We have run a full consultation with all previous depository library members. We have had a lot of inputs from libraries globally, and we have a lot of plans for that, and we're quite optimistic, I have to say. Okay, so this is Action 30. So I will read Action 30, which is, we will ensure that science, technology, and innovation contribute to the full enjoyment of human rights by all. And I would like you all please to sort of like, everything you heard about AI in this wonderful conference, just mirror it against this. And then I have some ideas that we have been discussing in New York that relate directly to this, which is the idea of providing secure digital repositories for research. Data spaces to counter surveillance, right? This is a big issue. We have had third-party vendors selling library data. This is unheard of. So I will repeat, third-party vendors that work with libraries selling library data to immigration services. So again, we will ensure that science, technology, innovation contribute to the full enjoyment of human rights by all. We have some ideas about hosting forums on tech ethics, what we call them AI bias audits, which is like a fancy term for tech ethics, more or less. Then we see libraries, and we would like to pass that through the Charter Libraries Network as inclusion innovators, in a sense that, what about vulnerable groups, right? Where do they access tech? Participatory design in tech, especially for disabled groups, low number of VNRs and so on. I think these OECD statistics, the last I found was that 82% of national libraries in OECD countries, they offer digital literacy programs for refugees, secure browsing tools against surveillance. This is really interesting. This is a new environment for libraries, and I think this is the point that we need to accelerate a little bit what we do. I mean, I'm a librarian for over 25 years now, so definitely it is new to me. Improve gender equality. Yes, we're not there yet. Of course, as libraries, we come from this tradition that I remember my discussion with a dear colleague who now retired, and she told me, you know what, I think my parents pushed me to librarianship because it was a safe profession back then for women. What does this tell us about where we started? At the moment, I think the one big achievement of the Secretary General in the United Nations is that we have achieved parity in the United Nations on levels, on almost all levels, with the exception of one level, and we're talking about 50-50 parity. But what does that mean for actual work, and how did we try to, again, walk the walk, just talk the talk? So we ran an interesting project. My colleagues in the metadata unit ran an interesting project where they worked with almost 5,000 representatives in the Security Council, 1946 to today. And they had no diacritics, right? There was no gender on that names. And of course, some names were impossible to more or less locate. But yet, my colleagues worked. They worked with embassies, they worked with missions, they emailed countries, and they managed to create a full data analysis dashboard on gender representations in the Security Council of the United Nations. And she here, who was the first female Security Council president. And it happened for the first time in 1972 with a representative from Guinea. Again, there are some ideas on creating safe spaces online, but also offline. Many times we talk about online, but we forget the offline. Again, the digital literacy programs combating harassment, anonymous reporting tools for cyber violence, and I think you will see this also recurring in this presentation around policies, algorithmic literacy workshops. So this is increasingly a very important aspect for our audiences, from researchers or early career researchers up to professors and deans of universities. And of course, I'm not going to talk about the leadership pipelines, and this is, I'm sure, something that is being developed already. Indigenous knowledge is an extremely important aspect of the Pact of the Future, and I was glad to see several sessions in this conference. I managed to attend only one. But the idea of using the FRIC framework, the free, prior, and informed consent, and I think there was a very interesting, there is a very interesting example of, if I'm not mistaken, New Zealand, yes, the New Zealand National Library Maori Manuscripts Project, as well the Amazon's Library of the Forest audio archives. Very interesting projects that were very careful and using, like, not only when manipulating or collecting data, using not only the fair aspect, but also the care principles for managing data. Action 33, I think, is also quite important, which is about UN partners. So this is mostly partnered with the UN. So the member states and the missions, the permanent missions, the delegates and the researchers suggested that, there should be greater partnerships with the UN. And that is indeed something that is more or less progressing quite well. We have, from the UN Dakamsco Library, we have one partnership that is quite interesting, is the ETH Zurich partnership with the UN. And we have just put forward a project, and I'm glad to say that our project was accepted, and we're working on that. And this project is, I think it's quite interesting. So we have the Security Council, General Assembly, Human Rights Council. There is voting in those councils, right? And there's voting, I mean, in two of the organs since 1946, and the other organs since 72. So there is a source of data, a wealth of data that is very interesting. So we devised a little bit of a data analysis project, and we're going to work with ETH Zurich in order to identify trends, dynamics, relationships. So I think it's going to be a quite interesting project. We will definitely publicize the results. But going beyond that, and I remember someone's question here from yesterday. Yes, I will repeat. It's a very new geopolitical environment. But again, if we want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, it is extremely important that everything is localized, right? So we need to work locally with these big, high-level ambitions in mind. We need to work on the subnational level, on the national level, in the governmental level, and so on. So the aspect of localizing, and I think it's important to browse through about the critical importance of localizing the SDGs, which is the latest report from our colleagues in New York about the SDGs. I was speaking in another conference, and I recall asking the question, who in here knows, for example, the government entity that reports on open science monitoring to UNESCO? Excellent. Wonderful. So this, I think, is a very interesting survey that we need to run around the world, right? So I do recall someone telling me, well, we're still searching to find out which government official is the one that is doing that. Similarly, then we have the voluntary national reviews, right, of the SDGs. So these need to have the output and impact of libraries of all kinds, research libraries. So every work that relates to policy should be represented in these voluntary national reviews. And then when they are submitted into our colleagues' database on the SDGs implementation and framework, it is much, much easier for us to elevate the work of libraries within the global policy framework. And of course, the UN partnerships, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's an interesting idea to engage with the Charter Libraries Knowledge Network, engage with us, engage with Open Science Conferences, not only the UN Open Science Conference, all the UN conferences, all the Open Science conferences around the globe. We have a vision of a UN data hubs connected to the Charter Libraries. So there is a very creative moment. I want to repeat again. There is hope for very creative moments ahead of us. There's also pragmatism. So hope is nice. I like hope. I think that's the work of the UN, right? the UN is here because there is hope. But there is the major mission of the organization, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is, I think, one of the most impactful reports that came out about the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. And you see here there is, how they call it, the middle of the road pathway, when actions we take are, conservative enough. And there is the high ambition, as they call it, the high ambition sustainable development pathways. So we're extremely far off track on the SDGs. And there is no way that we will achieve the SDGs with the conservative approach, the middle of the road pathway. Now that should give us a message. Libraries and the work of information actually informs all 17 SDGs, right? This is the interconnection of the SDGs. How can we achieve public health without access to health information? I don't get that. How can we achieve employment without access to employment information? I mean, the New York Public Library is actually lending costumes for people to go and participate in interviews, right? It might sound simplistic, but it's actionable, it's impactful. So I just want to draw your attention to the Global Sustainable Development Report. This report was a request by the member states. It is produced every 4 years. This is the last one. The next one is coming in 2027, if I'm not mistaken. And it is not a report that is written by UN staff like me. It is a report written by an independent group of scientists and experts. It's about 15 scientists, and they're appointed by the Secretary General. They're independent, which means that they produce the results, they produce the report, and then we just listen to it. And this report, I think, was very eye-opening, especially for libraries, because what the report said, that there's only one way to go forward, and that is science, through transformations in science. I would like to hear university administrators, if are here, faculty members, right? There is a duty here. And the duty is that in order for science to progress, open science to be implemented, universities need to change certain practices. So I don't want to preach to the converted, but what's the global science system in Switzerland, and what's the global science system in the global south, right? Or do we understand it the same way? Equity, there is a considerable issue on equity, and with my open science hat here, I want to say that South America is completely pioneering in open science practices. Have we learned from that in Europe? The second request from the report is socially robust science. In a nutshell, this means science must be related or must be done for benefit of society, for the benefit of everyone. There are systemic barriers, like low middle-income countries, for example, 60% do not have funding. There is research that is ignored in crisis zones. For example, Yemen's water management, there was a research that was ignored, and sort of, certain science went with a solution, but there was already research done locally. What I mentioned before, the local and the global and the national. Of course, there are vested interests regarding climate change, and despite the fact that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has a consensus, it is a crisis. Decolonizing of science, again, if you see, there was an interesting research that was done I think it was 8 years ago. One researcher, I apologize, I don't remember his name or her name, went into Web of Science and extracted the research that was reported in Web of Science and sort of like put it on the map. So if you saw the global map, you would see that research is happening in North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, And then in Africa, you see just a very thin line. South America, you see an extremely thin line. So it's a very distorted map of the world. I think it was a very visually inspiring output regarding exactly the fact that research needs to be seen globally. South-South collaborations, again, connecting to the first policy. Per scientific papers with implementation toolkits, for example, this has been the SDG policy labs, the youth advisory groups that are embedded in National Science Council. These are some interesting aspects, I'm certain that, and I look forward to hearing more about that. What is interesting, and I think this is a connection to citizen science that I will mention later on, is that this specific report that I'm still talking about came up that with the result that projects co-designed with communities have 4 times higher adoption rates by the communities. Finally, trust and integrity in science. We talked about algorithmic biases and applications throughout the conference. There is an erosion of trust in science, which is, I think, very important, and we do have a role for that. And again, I link back to citizen science about this. And then sort of like seeing libraries as speed boosters for science, like hosting preprint, algorithmic literacy, what I mentioned before, algorithmic workshops and so on, and partnering with fact checkers and beyond. For open science, I think the only thing I want to say that it is non-binding for the so 193 member states have agreed and ratified on that. It is not binding, but it's still very, very influential. I think I don't want to preach to the converted here. I think you must be quite aware of all aspects of open science. I'll go quickly through these. But the only thing I want to say is that the transition from paywalls to institutional repositories and community-owned platforms is still evolving. I don't think we're there yet. We need to assert the right to read and publish, and we need to accelerate open educational resources integration in curricula. And again, I want to talk to universities about that. I want to talk about research institutions and, of course, libraries. The only one thing that I wanted to state here is the rapporteur, the Human Rights Council rapporteur, Alexandra Xanthaki, who sort of like mentioned that she stressed that the right to participate in science through varied modalities must be guaranteed for all, and she advocates for multiple and wide-ranging society policy interfaces and special measures to remove obstacles to the exercise for that right. Scientific freedom must be guaranteed, and a human rights approach to science must be implemented at all levels by all actors. I have the feeling I'm preaching to the converted here. Open science changes libraries, of course. Very welcome. So from purveyors to information to stakeholders and ambassadors of open science, curators of scientific results and fair and care data principles, brokers of data ecosystem, all wonderful aspects. A special place for citizen science again, because it had already exemplified significant impacts in ecology. It's not a byproduct. Citizen science is not a byproduct anymore, especially in invasive species tracking. It boosts scientific literacy, skills, and public engagement, and then it effectively operates at the intersection of science, education, and community engagement, more or less boosting the trust in science, because everyone is exposed to the scientific process, right? The critical inquiry. What is science? Critical inquiry. There are some challenges that we identified in the previous conference, and we're bringing these challenges for discussion in the 4th conference regarding the implementation of open science, and you will see it again. Science is a public good, not for commercial interests. Library capacity and skills gap, so I've heard already about this. I think investment is to be redirected to upskilling and reskilling staff and other very important areas of our work. I don't think we need to pay 3 digits to specific commercial publishers, but rather redirect the funds where that is possible. And I think it is possible. We've seen libraries do it in North America and Europe. Equity and inclusion. So what does equity mean? That's a very interesting discussion, I think, for all of us here. What is equity in science? What is equity in open science? We need to research more about this. We need to develop a shared understanding. I see equity. We talk In New York, we talk about like hundreds of actors on open science. Still not defined. We don't have, I think, a shared understanding about that. This is going to be brought into the 4th Open Science Conference. And again, I want to go back to universities, right? Universities have a duty to society to implement open science. Again, national, subnational, local, universities. We need to change the incentive and reward system. Otherwise, I don't think open science is going to be implemented, and we're just going to be talking about processes and projects, and I want to go to this one. A very interesting article written by a colleague from South Africa, who more or less poses the question, are open science actors slowly moving from a movement with a purpose to a movement for a process? Just developing processes, right? Open science processes. Great, open science processes are great. We should not just forget a little bit the grand approach on open science. The values of open science are still, I think, throughout mentioned, and I already mentioned the issue, the aspect of language and bibliodiversity. I think this is extremely important, and I don't see this being enough acted upon in the many discussions that we have, even though, again, the Global South comes up with some very pioneering projects. And there are two pieces of articles that I think quite interesting. Very interestingly, the piece on the right, on the left, is behind a paywall, so I hope you will have access to it from your university. I'm talking about equity, right? What is equity, I wonder? So I think what looms big here is that we need to reform scientific or scholarly publishing. I would like to invite you to please watch this lecture by Professor Zabel. It's about fraud in science. More or less, he's done a research with his team. 250,000 papers per year are fraudulent. They are created with AI or other paper mills institutions. At the same time, I think it's the work of Juan Pablo Perin and colleagues about the oligopoly of academic publishers. I think it's a very interesting piece that we need to perhaps consider about more. And go back to the International Science Council, very simple and very, very straightforward approach to how we're going to reform scientific publishing. So I want to send, I think, my third or fourth call to universities that there are 8 principles the International Science Council has identified that can more or less guide us forward on that. I'm not going to go through the 8 principles. The link is here, but I think it's a discussion that needs a couple of keynotes in order to go through this. Now, to one policy, it's not exactly a policy. It is a policy from the UN Secretariat, so it has been consulted with member states. So member states, I want to rephrase that, has been consulted with permanent missions to the UN, and of course with several actors around the globe. I think this is a very interesting policy, again, for libraries. It's all about misinformation, disinformation, hate speech online. It puts forward 5 core principles, and these are the principles that my colleagues and the work I also participated into that. I want to acknowledge also Article 19 concerns about this policy, but I think it's very relevant for the work of libraries. I think I have 4 minutes, yes. So societal trust and resilience means that it refers to the confidence people have in the reliability and accuracy of the information they access. Why? AI-generated manipulation affects youth and marginalized communities. Platform algorithm bias affects vulnerable groups, such as women, ethnic or marginalized minorities, among others. Coordinated disinformation affects journalists, and citizen activists, among other groups. Health incentives is about advertising, and so advertising and technology companies can adopt business models that simultaneously uphold human rights, go again to the other policy, and strengthen information integrity and make good business cases. So engagement-driven algorithms amplifies hate and disinformation 60% faster, MIT 2023. Opaque ad tech supply chains, 40% of ads fund harmful content unknowingly, AASA 2024. Behavioral tracking monopoly. 90% of digital ad revenue goes to 5 firms, Statista 2023. The third principle is shifts in tech company policies and increased media literacy can empower users with greater control over their online experience and the use of their own data. I think this is pretty straightforward for the work of research libraries. 65% of users don't understand how platforms use their data. Pew Research 2023. 3.2 billion people remain offline, 80% in the Global South, ITU 2024. The next principle, independent, free, and pluralistic media. So information integrity is only achievable with an independent, free, and pluralistic media. Robust and urgent responses are needed to support public interest journalism around the world. So, well, this refers to editorial standards. At the same time, I think it is important to note that so nowadays, computer scientists, I don't know, in California, that just came to my mind, a computer scientist in California has access to audiences that the editorial board of New York Times will never see. And all that through the change in the technological landscape. And I think the issue of editorial standards, I think perhaps libraries can offer some suggestions around that too. And transparency and research, and again, this is, I think, quite important for our work. 5 technology firms control 80% of the global data flows, Statista 2023. We know of AI black boxes. I think I haven't heard enough about open source AI, and I think that's quite important. Global South scholars face 3 times more legal hurdles accessing platform data, Oxford Internet Institute 2023. 62% of misinformation studies focus on North America and Europe, Nature 2023 meta-analysis. And 90% of tech headquarters are in 3 countries and influence global rules, UN Trade and Development Office 2024. So there is a call to researchers and institutions, and I think it is very important for us, and I want to also acknowledge the work that IFLA is doing around that, so shout out to colleagues from IFLA on that, and I think we need to work all together on this. I want to put forward, I think, an interesting example from the G20, a global initiative for information integrity on climate change. That is one of the priorities of the Secretary General. I think it would be quite important to co-create an initiative on information integrity. So many topics around that we can think of, but definitely on research for information integrity and the role of libraries and so on. So I think it's a very interesting room for discussions. Again, algorithmic literacy is extremely important, and this is something that we need to be more active, including us at the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library, but I need to upskill my colleagues, I need to upskill myself. Finally, and I only have 17 seconds, but it is very important, it is pretty high level compared to the discussions that are more practical that I hear around, but I think it is important that there is a need to govern AI for the benefit of humanity, right? So science as a public good, oh, it's over. So yeah, so the benefit of humanity, sorry, these are the important recommendations that come from this policy. This is a policy of the organization. And I just want to stay a little bit to the actions, because I had also some questions, and I don't know if that can be relevant to all of us. To build value-driven libraries, partnerships with the libraries, universities, civil society, and authors, collaborate with established AI providers. So I know there was an interesting point of creating our own AI, which is great and awesome, and we should do it, provided there is investment. But we need to work with the established AI providers. And we need to sort of like, as part of our work, to bring some, I'm going to use the term, information management perspective into AI. So what I mean is actually a little bit of the librarian logic into it. And I think it's going to make it much, much better than what it is today. A human handoff process, I think, a human handoff protocols, I think, are very important in a point that I don't think we can escape virtual agents. But the point, what is the point, what is the framework, what is the point that a virtual agent passes the request, whatever that request may be, to a human agent, right? How will this happen? Perhaps there's need for more research on that, including verification and source citation. And finally, the structured thesaurus that we've been working on for so long. I mean, I know that, cataloging is not fancy. I know that, okay. But taxonomies, right, ontologies, tagging systems, if you want to call them, are extremely important, especially for this, at this early stage of all these systems. And I mean, we do have one dedicated to the SDGs, so please feel free to contact us if you want to use it. We'll be happy to showcase it to you. It's available in the 6 official languages, and you can filter the content based on a structured language. Right. And I think I want to close here, and I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I went 5 minutes over. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you for this, Thanos, and also a small landmark for LIBER that you and libraries are attending a keynote at our conference, so thank you a lot for that. So we are able to take a few questions, and while you think of the first questions from the floor, I do have one for you, because it seemed that your whole analysis is built around a transformation of research in order to address these global wicked problems that we're all facing and that are probably too difficult for one entity to solve by themselves. And you also have this very powerful statement of libraries as speed boosters of science. So what it really comes down to is how science and library impact people and communities. Would you care to expand a little bit on that? How could LIBER and organizations, you mentioned new partnerships, how could we collaborate to create more impact this way?
I think it's important that we start discussing about these aspects, and just bring on the table the fact that even though LIBER is a European association, it is now active on a global field. And I think it is very important that for LIBER and the knowledge that LIBER has been carrying since 2012, at least that I've been following, is more or less shared with entities in the Global South, and through that creating partnerships. I think the UN also is a good partner, and also the UN system of organization, and not only the UN, the United Nations New York, right? I'm talking about the UN system of organizations, which is all around the globe, with specific mandates. UNESCO, I think that coming together and creating or co-creating initiatives that can invite people, that can invite openly, right? Because open consultations is what we need. I think, there goes the point with the 5 people in a room that were decisions or perhaps initiatives discussed. I think these open consultations, as we saw from the UN Charter, Libraries Network, are extremely powerful and very important, because no matter what, the researcher at the desk has a different perspective from me, and I need to hear the perspective of the researcher from the desk. I was talking with the advisory committee of the Open Science Conference, and one of the aspects that they liked in this conference is that we make sure that 40% are early career researchers of the participants and panelists and speakers. And we hear directly from them, and together we try to put forward suggestions and solution initiatives. They don't always get the spotlight, we don't want that, but they're sort of like evolving all around us.
Thank you. And I think we have a first question up here, please.
Thank you. Thank you for a really fascinating and very, very rich presentation. I'm David Prosser. I'm from the Research Libraries UK, but my other hat is that I'm the chair of the board of the Directory of Open Access Journals, which is a key piece of underpinning infrastructure for open science, and that's what I wanted to ask you about. There are so many pieces of infrastructure for open science that we need to support and to fund and to run. Are the discussions that you're having, the discussions in your meetings, discussions within the United Nations, are you thinking about how we can sustain those pieces of infrastructure? At the moment, it seems to me there's an assumption that people in this room will continue to support those, but I don't think that we can do all of the things that we need to do to realize the visions that you're talking about. So how can we really put those pieces of infrastructure on a very firm footing and support them for the long term?
First of all, thank you. And again, apologies, I did not send a shout out to you, but I will in my next presentation. And I also want to a shout out to repositories for the Coalition of Open Access Repositories. I think I saw Kathleen around. So hi, keep up the work. So yeah, I think, so the UN can play its convening role, and we do have a convening power, right? To bring these discussions on the table and see how together we can work around these very important issues of sustaining the infrastructures. And I consider this perhaps one of the most important issues as we go along with open science. I also want to emphasize, and I don't recall if I said it, but we work very close together with UNESCO. So UNESCO is the mandated organ. Our work was to bring this to New York. So we started doing that since 2018. Then that time was a movement, right? So after the recommendation, it became a policy. So now we see that we need to change also the conference itself to bring this dialogue on the table and see how we can find solutions together. This is a wonderful initiative. Which action? Pick action. You know, practicality to ambitions, because otherwise they're just going to remain ambitions. So, I mean, governments have signed them, so we need to do something about them.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the floor? I think we have one up back here, please.
Thank you. I'm Leticia from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, University Library, and it's connected to the previous question. Because within the library community, we are all very much aware of the importance of the science as a public good and infrastructure for publishing. But in my experience, at least in contact with researchers and civil society, when people talk about open access and open science, it's very much about the fact that publicly funded research should be accessible by non-scientists and the Global South, which is of course extremely important. But I think we need to do a better job in convincing people that it's about the ownership of infrastructure and the ownership of publication channels and Diamond Open Access and all of that infrastructure. But then there's a conflict with the incentive structure for researchers, right? So even if they have access to publishing in Diamond Open Access, but they should perhaps publish in the fancy label journal that should advance their careers. So my question to you is, how do we convince the actual researchers doing the research and publishing that this is in their best interest, that it matters? Because I think once we do, we are going to get funding.
Yeah. For a very small period of my professional career, I worked at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. One thing we had then with open science was convincing researchers share their data, share their research, and so on. That is an issue, but I want to send my fifth, and I will not stop sending calls to universities, because this is the work of university, and I think as part of our duty is to raise awareness within the discussions with the university, the faculty, the administrators, that this is where open science has to change, by changing the incentives and the academic rewards, right? So I have to be pragmatic as well. I'm a human staff, so we have some specific approach, but I also have to be pragmatic. If the university doesn't assist there, right, how do we go forward? So it is the university. I mean, it is a different, I think the call should be to education, and there was a wonderful policy from, not policy. It was a wonderful conference, Transforming Education, that took place in New York. I think it was one of the best conferences I attended. Again, wonderful ambitions, right? So we need to see them in action, and I think we need to sensitize and mobilize universities to revisit this academic awards and incentives, research incentives system, so that we are able to implement open science. What my colleague from South Africa said, from the purpose to the process, let's go back to the purpose a little bit. But I think, like, just very pragmatically, and I don't know if that's a solution, I would probably create a little bit of an infographic. How many times open access research is cited compared to closed access. because the academic world I think it's no longer the struggle to be published. I think this is more or less receding. The struggle is now to be read. And I think this is where we need to start, as libraries, any type, be more active, including public libraries, right? Because this is important. Public libraries are very important for citizen science. So we need to upskill, reskill, and make sure that, you know, we acknowledge the struggle to be read and what we have to offer.
And I think we have time for one, perhaps two questions. So in the front, please.
So I'm Julien Roche, I'm the University Librarian at the University of Lille, and I'm also the LIBER President. So first of all, thank you for accepting our invitation to speak this morning, and a very nice presentation. It's more like a general alert for you and the decision makers in the United Nations, because you mentioned great expectation for research libraries, for public libraries, and for universities. The alert is the following: the universities are increasingly facing difficulties in the present society, you know, and so are the libraries. Just to mention the kind of difficulties we are facing, you know that academic freedom is attacked more and more in many countries, everywhere. Higher education and research is definitely not a priority for decision makers. We can have very nice speeches, you know, from decision makers. The reality is that we are not a priority. We are also facing immediate threats, just like, for instance, critical databases in some disciplines that are at threat everywhere, including in countries that are essential for science, including countries like the United Nations have its own headquarters at the moment. Science is questioned everywhere, and we have something that is very worrying. We have an assimilation between science on one hand and opinion on the other hand. And to finish with, open science is not seen by citizens as a priority now to, let's say, face the challenge mentioned in the SDGs you have summarized. So in a nutshell, universities are ready to move on, are ready to take the responsibilities you are asking for, but we need help, we need support, and we need money at some point.
So,
Thank you. Yes, please.
On that point, I wanted to repeat what the Secretary General said. Nerves of steel and values. So if universities do not uphold values, well, I think I'm going to go to a Greek island and, you know, have pina colada or something. So it's, I don't understand, I mean, I see these problems. I hear about them all the time. But we have examples also in the country that I happen to reside at the moment, that there are universities that stuck to values, there are universities that did not stick to values. I understand that losing research grants of that level is unbelievable. I mean, right, we never thought about that coming this direction. However, partnerships among universities can get us a long way. Sticking to values can get us a long way. Nerves of steel is what we need, and again, I don't think I have to explain that. We have to exemplify nerves of steel every day back at my institution, and working together with libraries, and just sort of like, let's revisit a little bit the budget. Let's revisit even the library budget, right? Why should it go into that direction and not other direction, right? Why shouldn't we upskill, take them funds, upskill our staff, and make able to offer, you know, I don't know, this algorithmic workshopping, for example, or coding, or coding for women and girls, for example, which is very popular where I live at the moment. But I do see the point, and of course I do not have the magic ball to say to that, but the only thing I have is values, right? So universities are there to uphold values. Academic freedom is academic freedom, and we have to support it no matter what. You know, there are diplomatic ways of I think, approaching these things. But there is a capacity within universities to change. And I think we should not forget that. I understand the larger picture, but within universities, there is a capacity. And that is the capacity we want to use. With nerves of steel. I understand.
Thank you. And on that note, The good news is that, Thanos, you are at the conference also today, later today, and also for the
Tomorrow.
dinner. So there are ample chance to convene and discuss with you. And on that note, we are serving lunch in a little moment. But once again, a big hand for our keynote. Thank you.
Thank you.